Appreciate you all taking some time out of your day to join this session. We're going to talk about EDR, talk about MDR, and really how you can cut through the hype and figure out what's best for your organization. So I'm going to start with a bit of a background on all the terminology that you all hear, AV versus next-gen AV versus EDR and MDR. I realize for many of you that's going to be background. You already know that already. But I think it's helpful to remember the history of how we got to the EDR and the MDR world, and also help level set, because I think there is a lot of confusion with a lot of different vendors throwing these acronyms out when they don't always mean the same things. I'm going to give you some tips on how you can best evaluate EDR providers. And then a lot of that is going to be, well, do you need an MDR service on top of your EDR technology? The answer will probably be yes for most of you. In that case, we'll talk about what to look for in an MDR solution, and then what are really the kind of categories of MDR providers out there. Before I jump into the presentation, I want to talk about myself. It's my favorite topic, so I figured I'd leave with that. So why should you listen to me or not listen to me? So if you notice on the title slide, I just wrote the term vice president. The truth is, the dirty secret of this presentation is I am in product marketing. And normally you don't put that on a webinar because people never want to hear from, quote unquote, the marketing guy. But for this particular topic in this webinar, it's actually really relevant. For myself, I've been working in cybersecurity for vendors specifically for almost 20 years. I know it's hard to believe by my youthful look, but it is true. And specifically as a product marketer, my main expertise is on positioning. And that's really important when you're trying to think about, well, why would I choose this provider or that provider or this feature or that feature? I'm not going to get into technical depth. So this is not a technical conversation. This is trying to understand the big high-level differences between why you would go with one solution versus the next. And that's really what positioning is. It's trying to figure out who is the audience that's best served for this and how does it differentiate from everything else that's in the marketplace. So in this particular case, I've been doing that for 20 years. So I have a good base of understanding to talk about. And more specifically, I haven't just been working in cybersecurity. I have been working in endpoint, AV, EDR, XDR, MDR, all the acronyms I've been doing, specifically launching next-gen AV from I was at a startup called Invincia that got bought by Sophos. It did deep learning-based malware detection. At Sophos, I launched their EDR, their XDR, the MDR products. I had a stint at Red Canary, where we were focused specifically on MDR, and now here at Huntress, as well as about a decade I spent at RSA as well in my career. So that's why you should listen to me. But full disclosure, I do work for Huntress. I am going to do my best on this presentation to make it as neutral as it can be for you all, so you can really make a decision that works for you. Obviously, I hope many of you hear this presentation, if you're not already a Huntress customer or partner, would walk away and be more likely to work with us. But I also hope a few of you look at what we have and look at the positioning of everyone else in the marketplace and realize there might be something else that's more suited to help your organization. Really, the point of this is to try to figure out what that is and how to get to that point. So speaking of how we got to that point, how do we get here? EDR and MDR, these are terms we're seeing very ubiquitous today in the cybersecurity landscape, but it wasn't always that way. If you're going back ancient history, which actually wasn't that long ago, but it feels like it was, in the early days, we just had antivirus. And antivirus worked really well for a really long time using signatures to automatically block threats at the endpoint. Essentially, the idea there is we've seen this before. We know it's bad. Let's block it. Pretty basic concept. But attackers use things like polymorphic malware. They used other types of techniques that evaded regular antivirus. And even if it wasn't in large volumes, even a 1% miss rate, given how much activity there was out there, led to big losses. So the next concept came, one of the worst we ever came up with in our industry, which is instead of just AV, next-gen AV, which means everything and nothing all at the same time. But essentially, next-gen AV just meant we took what was normal AV, we added behavior-based detection, and then AI or machine learning, or like the startup I work for, specific type called deep learning. And that was to look at like the DNA of malware. So the idea there is like either we looking at your behavior and we know what you're up to and it's not good, so we're going to block you, or we've never seen you before, but we looked at the DNA, essentially the code behind the file, and realized, hey, you're claiming you're legitimate, but I looked at your DNA, you look pretty bad, we're going to go ahead and block you. That was a huge improvement, but obviously attackers can still get by automated perimeter-based defenses, and EDR realized that. So EDR came about mostly to look at all the stuff that endpoint security was missing, the AVs were missing. But the other real main use case was, what about the stuff that's not so obviously good or so obviously bad that we automatically block it or automatically let in? What about that gray zone in between? And for that, it was like, well, this looks suspicious. This looks shady. What we need is a really smart human to investigate that, make that call. And the EDR platform was built to help that smart human make that decision. Over time, people realized, well, what if we added more data in there? This platform's working, and go beyond the endpoint and bring in other data sources. That's where XDR came in on top of it. There's really two ways to think of XDR. There's EDR plus, so EDR vendors that then just added more data sources. That's probably the most common. But there's also a lot of SIM vendors who conceptually are doing the same thing, taking a lot of data, trying to make sense of it and find bad things, sort of rebranding themselves XDR, which I think was pretty confusing in the marketplace. But the idea here is, let's broaden our visibility, let's add context, let's get better at investigating and responding to threats. But most people realize we can't do this. There's too much data. It takes too much time. You need to be doing this 24/7, and we need to sleep. We need to enjoy our weekends. We need to go on vacation. We need help. And that's where managed detection and response came in. So 24/7 coverage by a third party. A lot of nuance in all of these things here, particularly for EDR and MDR, which is what I'm going to dig into. So if you are evaluating an EDR today, this is my checklist of things that you should be thinking about. The first is, where is the data coming from, right? And what type of data is coming from? If you're just focused on the endpoint, that's great. And that's probably 90+% of what people care about today. But with the explosion of the XDR market, some of that is just rebranding EDR to XDR, but some of the more advanced XDR solutions really are taking in data from multiple sources to give you a broader set of context. So that's an important thing to think through, is like, how broad do you want to go, especially if you have a team of analysts internally looking at this data or hunting through this data? Do they have the expertise to not only look at endpoint threats, then incorporate the context, let's say, from network telemetry on top of that? Something difficult to do for most teams. One of the biggest things about EDR is detection efficacy. So in the earlier days of EDR, and even some today, mostly what they are investigation tools. But a good EDR will first bubble up the things that they think are bad, they think are suspicious, that need that smart human to go and look at. So trying to find an EDR solution that actually determines what is, your top priorities for the day, what are the little clues that they found to tip you off so you can start your investigation, is really important. The problem here is it's really hard to determine who is good at detection efficacy. There's obviously third-party reviews. I'll talk about that later in the presentation that help. Some have different types of coverage. I would focus less on who says they have more coverage or who's getting the greatest reviews, and first start in understanding, like, what is that your actual threat vector looking like? If you are a very large enterprise that expects to see leading edge or bleeding edge attacks, whether those be 0 days or really just attacks that are less familiar to most, then you need a more sophisticated tool. If you're a pretty typical organization, most of the EDRs that have some sort of detection engineering in it should be able to help you there. A lot of what you need to look at is, okay, once the EDR does find something, how does it bubble up that information to you? Is it a priority list? Is it a risk score? That will really make a big difference on how easily you can action that information. Speaking of which, one of the main things you're going to do with that EDR is EDR will pump out and say, hey, we found something bad. Now you need to go look into it. The most important capability of an EDR, the thing that really sets them apart from each other, is that investigation console. How easy is it for an analyst to utilize? How much context is added in there? So some of the more advanced EDRs will have things like threat intelligence feeds go in and tell you their third-party opinions, sandboxing, other ideas that will tell you exactly what tip them off in the detection and kind of help guide that investigation along ways. Some of the weaker ones will just say, hey, we found this, go look into it, without a lot of steps to do so. That's fine if you have a really good set of analysts on the other end of the screen. But if you have a range of analysts, particularly ones that are less experienced, you're not going to get a ton of value out of those types of tools. The next thing is threat hunting. Threat hunting is the most overused and misunderstood term in our segment of the industry. You will see tools that market themselves specifically as threat hunting tools, and you will see other ones that don't even mention threat hunting. What is even threat hunting? That's up for debate. So in my opinion, almost all EDR tools give you the ability to do threat hunting. So the difference to me between detection and investigation and pure threat hunting is usually detection and investigation. The tool itself is tipping you off that they found something bad and they want you to go look into it. Whereas threat hunting often implies that you're doing that without some sort of first clue. But that's not really the case, and that's not really how threat hunting works. Usually there is something that caught your interest that's making you dig a little bit deeper, peel back more layers of the onion to find out what's going on. Sometimes that could just be a list of IOCs you're given, indicators of compromise, that you are pushing against your environment to see if any of them have hits. That could be considered threat hunting. All of that is a long way of saying if someone says they do threat hunting or continuous threat hunting or proactive threat hunting, I would ask them to dig in and actually explain what that really means. It's extremely rare to mean that that is, the same thing from vendor to vendor. And regardless of how good the data sources are, the detections are, the investigation capabilities, they really mean nothing if the platform itself doesn't have good remediation options. So years ago, Gartner talked about little r and big R when they talked about EDR. And there's a really good way of thinking about it is that some tools say, hey, yeah, we can give you remediation capabilities, meaning once we find it, we could say you should go do something about it. And that counts as remediation. Whereas others had big R, which meant that they could actually give you the tools within the platform to do something about it. That would be like isolating a host, killing a process, deleting a file. Sometimes remediation is not even about remediating the actual incident, but kicking off a workflow. So what we've seen in the last few years, particularly at the top end of the market, is an integration between EDR tools and SOAR tools, security, orchestration, automation, and response. That means like if you found something in your EDR console, one thing you could do is kick off a workflow where you can have groups of people emailed, you can kick off tasks in Slack or whatever system you use to track them. Other remediation options could be automated. Hey, if we find A and we find B, then automatically do C right after that. Right? But digging into what those remediation options are and how well your team actually can take advantage of them and action them is really key to whether you'll have success with that EDR tool. And then last, I know a lot of people on this particular webinar are from the MSP community. Having worked at EDR and XDR vendors for many years, I would say MSP features are almost always an afterthought. I know at other places I worked, we released the product and then 6 months later, we released the product for MSPs, which gives you a good indicator of how prioritized they were. But if you are an MSP, you're going to look at specific features, most obviously being multi-tenancy and the ability to do this across multiple accounts in your environment. But don't forget that you need to do this internally for your own environment, even if you are an MSP. So these are my key list of capabilities. These are the things that you're going to want to dig into for whatever EDR vendor that you're looking at. It's not a yes or no type question. Each of these are subjective, and each of them has a lot of different subtleties. Even when you're looking at a third-party review, like Gartner Magic Quadrant, they have their idea of what a leader is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that would be the right choice for you. And if you asked one of those analysts, they would say the same thing. They're not going to go and say, everyone should use this particular vendor. They first want to understand, well, what are you trying to do? What does your team look like? What does your budget look like? What does your environment look like? And from there, different tools will match your needs. Okay. So the next question is, do I need an MDR on top of that EDR? So again, EDR is the technology, MDR is the service, right? And MDR can be service plus technology, but it's layered on top of the EDR. So if you're sitting there, it's like, do I need just an EDR tool or do I want to have the service on top of it? These are the questions you should ask. First, do you have a security operations center? Not a security team, but like an actual functioning security operations center. And does that SOC have 24/7 coverage, night and weekend coverage? Does it follow the sun? Like, what is your approach there? And what is the level of expertise on that team? And then make an honest assessment of the maturity of your security organization. Do you think you're one of the top 20% of security orgs out there? You know, if you're working for a Fortune 500, like a financial firm or defense industrial base, you probably have a pretty advanced security operations center, a lot of talent, a lot of security maturity within that organization. But most organizations probably don't meet those standards. And then even if you do, like, what is your team actually spending their time on, right? Are they chasing down noise from the tools that you have, most likely the EDR tool, your endpoint security tools, but all your other tools? You know, how much of it is just clearing out the queue to find the needle in the haystack? And then how much is keeping your head above water? Are you actually doing deep dive projects into things that really only your organization can do internally? Or these things that you're just spending, those are just things you'd like to be able to do, but honestly, you're spending so much time putting out fires that you don't have the ability to. I'd say very few people actually have the resources to dig into those special projects, and an MDR could really help take that burden off your plate if you're one of them. And then I'd be surprised if your answer isn't yes to this one, but is your security team overworked, stress? Working in organizations that have internal SOCs, the amount of toll it does from a mental health standpoint to people is pretty damaging and pretty hard to realize until you see people who work in that world. And people who get stressed, who get overworked, you know, it's harder for them to find those needles in the haystack. It's more likely that they miss threats. And this is why a lot of people go with an MDR, is to take that burden off their team. So I would say there's 3 options for EDR and whether you want to combine it with an MDR service on top of it. The first is fully managing in-house. This is EDR tool only. You have your internal team. You don't need an outside provider to help you. I would say you are only going to do this if you have a mature SOC, if you have the ability to have 24/7, 365 coverage, and you have a very well-resourced team. So it's not just that can you do it, but can you do it well around the clock? Is your team getting the tools that they need? Do they have the expertise they need, the training they need? Are you really a 1%er when it comes to security orgs out there? The second one is you see commonly in more mature security organizations is, yes, we have an EDR. We do have a team that can run it, but we still want an MDR layered on top of that. And the reason you do is, first of all, you need after-hour support. So even if you have coverage on nights and weekends, it's nice to have the MDR provider to give you full coverage there instead of just a skeleton crew, because attackers don't care what time it is where you live or what your office hours are. They will find you in the most inconvenient time, usually Friday afternoon before a holiday, as we know all too well here at Huntress. And then often you see the use case here is say, hey, I have a pretty mature team. We want to take all the really smart people that we pay a lot of money to internally and have them working on the stuff that only they can work on internally. And then have the MDR provider really take that burden off the team, deal with all the low-level noise, all the stuff normally like a tier 1 analyst would look at, which clears out the queue. It gets a lot of the hay out of the haystack, so you really can focus on the needles as well. And then for many orgs, it's having the EDR fully managed by a third party. So if you don't have a SOC, this is probably the best option for you. If you have limited security maturity inside your organization or under-resourced team, overstressed team, having that third party there running your EDR on your behalf will really make your life better and make your EDR deployment much, much more valuable. So if you are someone who should have an MDR but are trying to run it completely in the house, you're probably wasting money on the EDR tool. You're not going to get the full ROI out of it. So my hot take here is almost none of you should be on that left side. I say less than 5%. It's probably less than 1% of orgs that really should be using an EDR without an MDR provider. And having worked for both EDR tools, XDR tools, and for MDR services, I have yet to find many organizations that wouldn't get a lot of value of having the MDR service on top. Again, even if you're a mature org, it still provides a ton of value. And doing it all in-house costs more money. It's harder to pull off and probably will lead to less security in the long term. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that you need both an EDR and an MDR service. So you need both the technology and the 24/7 human support to look after it. So what should you be looking for when looking at the MDR providers? Obviously, 24/7 SOC coverage. Every single MDR provider is going to provide you 24/7 SOC coverage. So that's really table stakes at this point. There are a few. The reason I put it here is there are a few sort of rogue providers out there that say they do MDR, or sometimes MSSPs claim that they're an MDR provider, but they're not really providing 24/7 coverage by a SOC. So I really wouldn't consider them part of the category. But almost any vendor is at this point. So one of the biggest areas is around detection investigation. So this really separates the good from the bad when you're in consideration. So the questions I would ask any provider is like, what is the detection engineering or the detections you are adding on top of the EDR telemetry that you're looking at? So often what I've seen, and when I've seen bad rollouts or bad service providers, is they're just taking the alerts from a tool, whether it's their tool or someone else's tool, usually someone else's tool. They're bringing them in-house, they're clearing out the obvious noise, and then just regurgitating those alerts back to the customer. And that's not really doing what an MDR is supposed to do. It's not reducing alert fatigue. It's not separating the signals from the noise. And it's also not finding things in the data that the tool itself is missing. So detection engineering is the process that builds those detectors, but always ask the MDR provider, what value adding on top of the tool? What are you detecting that the tool itself is missing? Or what are you clarifying that the tool itself is missing? And how are you doing that? Is that human-led? Is that automated? It should be a combination of both. It should be smart humans using automation to help them do more in their day. My personal opinion is if you hear anyone tell you that they have an automated SOC, I would run in the other direction. I think that is marketing BS. Having written a lot of that marketing BS in my career, I can tell you that does not pass the sniff test for me. I also think if an organization is 100% human-led with very little technology, if they're purely a service without their own tech that they're using, that's not necessarily bad, particularly if they're a boutique MDR provider, but they can't scale. So if they have 10, 15, 20 customers, that's totally fine. If they have 100, it starts to get dicey. If they have more than 100, that's probably a rough estimate, then I would not use that MDR provider, because the only way for organizations like that to scale on the vendor side is to keep hiring more and more people. And as you all know out there, hiring people is difficult, and they don't stick around, and they'll have a pretty hard job, and they'll probably burn out pretty quickly. So you need to find a provider that has really smart humans, but have really amazing tech that make their job easier. That's the MDR providers you're going to want to look at. And all of the top ones should have a combination of the two. They might market themselves as being AI-driven or human-driven, but really dig into what that really means. The next thing to dive into is response options, right? So there's a lot of MDR providers, again, just like the EDR tools, that might find bad things on your behalf, but what do they actually do with that information? What are the response options? I break it out into 3 separate categories. Most of what an MDR is going to do is guided. Hey, we found something bad. Here are the 3 steps that you need to take in order to take care of it. The clarity and the way those are written and how they're delivered to you varies significantly from vendor to vendor, but they're all going to have some sort of guided response option. There's also automated response. There's probably some debate here of like how important it is to automate response. There are certain things that are easy to automate, particularly low-level alerts, like, hey, this is noise, you need to fix it, but like we'll go ahead and do it on your behalf. There are organizations who say, under no circumstances will I ever let you automate a response on my behalf. I don't trust the technology. We're always going to do it as people, as the smart humans in our organization. There's others who are like, I don't want to do any of the work, you automate it for you. But most MDRs should have some sort of automation option in their platform. And then the third is like human-led, right? Whether that having some sort of human look into the response and either walk you through it or do it on your behalf. Sometimes people call that hands-on keyboard response. Some people call that active remediation. But it is just a matter of having someone at the service provider actually remediate things on your behalf when they find it. So. The next thing is, okay, when we need to get in touch with you because something is going on in your environment, how do we actually do it? So this is often an overlooked part of MDRs. And usually when people leave MDRs, one of the things they hate the most is the actual service itself. So Just like any service industry, the interactions you have with them is really what makes the difference between a good and bad experience. So what channels are they using? How they get in touch with you? When they send you reports and incident notification, what is the depth of those, right? So I would always ask for samples of that in the buying cycle, or do a free trial or proof of concept if that's offered, to actually see what the level of depth is, right? So we talked about guided response. Like, the way you know whether the guided response will be helpful is that when you actually look at the reports, threat intelligence that they're sharing with you, and then how you want to communicate with them. So what we've seen is a lot of MDR providers actually cap their communication with you. So they might say something like, oh, we'll call you, but you only get one phone call a month. Or you can chat with us if you have questions, but you only get 5 minutes of chat a month, and then you get charged premium on top of that. My opinion is that if you are an MDR provider, your job is to help your customers, your partners get through the tough times, regardless of how much or little time and money that is costing you as a service provider. So I see less of it these days, but it's something still to check in on. Another thing to look at, and really honestly the hardest thing to judge, is the quality of the expertise and the quality of the service. So I mentioned that's the thing that you see people churn the most, is that, oh, I didn't like dealing with the analysts. They didn't know what they were talking about. The threat intelligence they were giving me was good, or I never got any. It's really hard to judge. And the other thing that comes up quite a bit is business terms, usually like, oh, they locked me into a 3-year deal, or I was unhappy and then I didn't have the ability to break the contract. There's a lot of different things on business terms that will matter to you as you look through this. I'm trying to figure out how to determine who has the best quality. I know I say as a marketer, like, we can say we have the best people in the world. And, when I work in Huntress, I feel like our expertise internally is really impressive. But I also felt that way at some of the other vendors I worked for too. And I also had competitors who would say, yeah, we have amazing experts. We have military grade this, or nation state proof that. And there's really no way to judge those claims. Anyone can claim them. So instead, I would look at the quality of the research that they're putting out. So look at the blogs they're writing, look at the webinars they're putting on, look at the community resources. That'll tell you a lot about what level of depth of expertise they actually have in-house. The other thing to look at too is peer review sites and finding out what other people experience there was. That's one area where I don't think the analysts are as in tune with, because usually when analyst reports come out, the vendors pick and choose the vendors that they want to push their way. So they're always going to push the happy ones. They don't necessarily proactively go out and find the unhappy ones unless they're looking at peer review sites as well. So, and then last, metrics and reviews. So particularly when you say, what metrics would you use to judge an MDR provider? This is a place where marketing fluff can really get in the way of evaluating who's good and who's bad. So MTTR and MTTD are the two most common: mean time to respond, mean time to detect. And you'll see this a lot, and I've certainly posted these stats too. It takes us 11 minutes here at Huntress when we detect a threat. It takes us 11 minutes on average to respond to a threat, which is a really fast amount of time and something we're really proud of. But those numbers, bluntly, can be very much manipulated by the vendor. I'll give you a few examples. So one common example is someone saying, oh, our mean time to respond is on average 3 minutes. Well, respond to what? Why does it only take you 3 minutes? Is that because your tool has flagging a ton of low-level incidents, like potentially wanted programs or things like that are not high priority, that you have automation built in that will make that mean time to respond go down really, really, really quickly because it's 90% fluff and you're doing with automation? Yeah, that's a good way to lower your mean time to respond, but it doesn't give you a really good metric to understand how fast you're going to be and how helpful you're going to be in a real situation. The other thing too is, do you want an MDR provider? Let's say there's some unusual threat that came in or something that is particularly nasty. It could take them a few hours of people investigating to find out what's going on. And you don't want a vendor out there that's going to say, well, we're not going to keep extending this investigation to get to the root of the problem or really understand it, because we want to make sure our MTTR stat is kept low. So we'll just remediate it and close it out in 30 minutes, knowing that the attackers are probably just going to come right back. So Again, I wouldn't dismiss MTTR, MTTE. They're definitely important statistics and metrics to look at, but you could always dig deeper into them and take them not as gospel. Okay. So what MDR options are out there? I'm going to bucket into three separate categories for the most part. So on the first one here, these are pure play, top rated MDR providers. So these are, when I say pure play, I mean they're not EDR vendors, they're not endpoint protection vendors. They're taking the MDR service and layering it on top of whatever technology you're bringing to the table. So since we're focused on EDR here, we're talking about bringing your own EDR. So if you think of Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Microsoft, Bitdefender, there's a bunch, Trend Micro, there's a ton of EDR vendors out there. The MDR provider may not service all of them, but they probably service a chunk of them. It's okay. For these, if you have any of these EDR tools, you can layer us on top and we'll take care of it. So why would you choose one of these? For the ones that really are the best of the best, you're going to get top of the line service. If you ask and you realize that they have strong detection engineering, it's a good sign that they're a top rated MDR and pure play here. So they're taking the data from the tools that they're integrating with, collecting that data and running their own detection engineering technology on top of it to find things that those tools either missed in the first place or to clarify what those things mean in the first place. And then they're going to have really top quality incident response. So a range of remediation options for you and communication options for you on top. So the best thing about them is you're going to probably have the best efficacy there in terms of finding threats. And you have the flexibility to work with whatever tools that you want, as long as that they're in their integration checklist. And especially if you're looking for more of an XDR play, you'll probably see a lot more breadth of integrations there beyond EDR as well. But they tend to be, you get what you pay for those services. And I worked for some of those vendors, and I would recommend them to anyone. But they are more expensive and they're more complex. They're designed for you to be a partner with a security operations team, not necessarily to completely replace that team or replace 90% of the work. So typically what I've seen is that when you have a mature security org with a decent amount of budget, then that is a perfect fit for you because you have someone who's sort of an equal to you from an expertise standpoint, collaborating with you when you do find something and taking a lot of the burden off your plate there. But again, that comes with price, that comes with complexity. If you are an immature security org, and that is not a diss, that is pretty much most security organizations, then they're probably not the best fit for you, right? It's not a bad option. It's just you're going to pay a lot and not get the full value of what you're paying for. There's also pure play MDRs that are much more on the budget side. So it's like, well, these are expensive. What about the ones that are inexpensive? And again, this is often a you get what you pay for situation. So you're still bringing your own EDR tool and the MDR services on top of that. And you can work, you have the flexibility again to work with whatever best of breed endpoint tool that you have at a lower cost. So that's really where the appeal comes on the pure play budget MDR. But I would say so many of them, particularly at the bottom of the market, are really just aggregating those alerts, putting a little bit of a filter on it, regurgitating them and throwing them back at you. And you see high churn there all the time because they're super noisy. And part of the reason you wanted an MDR service on top of your EDR in the first place was to eliminate all that alert fatigue. They tend to not have a ton of context that they're giving you. It's like, hey, we found this bad thing, go look into it. Which again, if you were trying to look for a provider that is a partner to you that's actually going to help guide that investigation, it's not particularly helpful. You could have done that without the MDR provider in the first place, because you could have taken the tip off from the EDR tool and looked into it in the tool that you already have today. So they're noisy, they don't provide a lot of context. And if you don't have that expertise in-house, they're really hard to action the recommendations that are coming out of there. There is obviously a range between the top rated MDRs and the budget MDRs. There's probably a lot of decent middle ground ones. But some are going to push more to the budget side. Some are going to move towards the top rated side. There's probably 3 or 4 really good ones that are in between there as well. The next category is what you usually see when you have a single vendor. So you have an EDR provider that has their own MDR that they've put on top of that. So 2 separate offerings. Hey, we'll sell you an EDR, and then a year later you come back and say, well, that was really hard to use. And they say, oh, no problem, we'll sell you the MDR on top of it. So it's like someone sells you a Ferrari and then you realize you can't drive it. And they're like, oh, don't worry, we hired a driver as well. That's an additional cost. So people like having the combination from one vendor. It's that one throat to choke concept. And in theory, but actually is not always the case, the vendor should be better at knowing how to use their own EDR tool than a third party would. I know that I worked for pure play MDR providers that we thought we were actually better at using the EDR tool than the EDR vendor was, but that's not always the case. So that's why people choose the single vendor, the single provider. But the reason they avoid it is because the service quality often varies quite a bit. So the reason, if you move back to the beginning of this presentation when I showed the history of how we got here, the reason that EDR providers added an MDR service is for one of two reasons. Most likely is because their EDR tool was so difficult to use and so hard to get value out of that the only way to make it actionable was to sell the service along with that. And the second one is simply because they know that there's a good market opportunity there, and they wanted to get that additional revenue. So in the those are the three main categories. Obviously, Huntress is where I work, and we're not really the same as those three. We're slightly different. So one of the biggest differences about Huntress is that we're a managed EDR service, which means we have the EDR product and the MDR service that are combined. So you can't bifurcate them, you can't split them out. The EDR service itself was built with the MDR service integrated into it, and you can't decouple them. So for our customers and our partners, that's exactly what they're looking for. So if you're an under-resourced org that's probably not going to go in and do all your own threat hunting and all your deep dive investigations on your own, this is the perfect solution for you. Because in every single one of these other three MDR provider options, you're still operating your own EDR tool on a day-to-day basis, doing your own investigations, doing your own hunting. With Huntress, that's not what we built it for and not what you actually can do with the product. So you get a strong value, you get a cult-like following of other partners and customers that really do love us. But there is downside. So I said, not everyone on this call will choose Huntress. It might not be the right one for you. Because we are fully managed, if you want to do your own threat investigation, your own threat hunting, if you have some sort of mature security team in-house, then we are probably not the right option for you. Because again, we do all of that on our customers and partners' behalf. We don't give you the ability to do on their own. That's partly how we can make our solution have a really strong value and really easy to use, is that we don't have to build features for that use case because our own internal team will do all that for you. So to sum it up, like the pure play top rated MDRs are awesome, but they cost a lot of money and they require a lot of maturity. So you have to take that into consideration, particularly if you're an under-resourced org. If you take one thing away, if you're half paying attention out there on this webinar and you're wondering, hey, if you're like half paying attention and just sort of chiming in now, the one takeaway is please avoid the budget MDR providers because you end up getting what you pay for. They don't save you time because they're noisy. They don't save you a ton of money because you still have to invest in your own team to do all the investigation and the work. And they end up causing just many problems as they solve. So again, there's a range of options between the dollar side and the X, but a lot of the ones really are those pure play budget MDRs are, please avoid them. A good tip off there is like, if it's often what you'll see is a non-security vendor who've added a service that they've partnered with a technology provider, an EDR provider, and they layered on top there at a low cost. That's usually a good sign that they're just in it to hit up a hot market and don't have a ton of detection engineering, and a ton of high quality service that they're building on top of it. And then within the single vendor product and service, honestly, it's a range there. There's some really good vendors there that their MDR is also really good. But I would say just because they have an EDR and an MDR, I wouldn't assume that the MDR portion is as good as their EDR. That's often the case. Okay. So I mentioned there's also third-party reports you can look at. So a few things. Forrester, Gartner, the one thing you need to know about them is they're really great. I've spent a lot of time within my career, but their target market, the people they're writing their reports for and their comparison reports are for large enterprises. So there are really good vendors out there that don't even qualify for those reports because that's not the market they serve. So Huntress is one of them, but even people who, vendors who service the mid-market wouldn't be on there. So like Forrester has an MDR wave, for example, like Sophos, which is a big MDR provider. They're not in Forrester's MDR wave because they're not considered to serve enough enterprise customers. And Gartner, while they have an EDR, or they call it EPP, Endpoint Protection Platform, Magic Quadrant, they do not have a Magic Quadrant for the MDR service, which should just be a testimonial to how difficult it is to actually delineate between different MDR providers. And Gartner still has not touched that. And it's been 5 years that people have been asking them for. Another one on the bottom left is MITRE. So you've probably heard of the MITRE attack evaluations. So on the EDR side, this has become really, really popular for vendors to participate in that. Essentially, there's some sort of scenario. The EDR then looks at that simulated attack scenario, and they get credited for their different areas of coverage. A few things about that. Most orgs don't actually need coverage for the entire MITRE attack framework. It's still good to have, but they actually don't need it. It's not really part of their risk profile. And also just having coverage doesn't necessarily make you better. It just means that you have the ability to see more things. There's still the investigation component. There's still the response component there. MITRE also has added a few versions of this for MDR. And the MDR version I find to be less valuable. It's essentially the same thing as the EDR test with extremely limited look at the service. So you're really just testing the underlying EDR technology for the most part on top of that. I know when I participated in the first round at a previous job, and they would give the MITRE attack mapping and say, oh, you found 80%, you had coverage for 80% of the attack that we threw out there. And then they would just give a zip file of the hundreds of emails and alerts that the vendor sent you, informing you of that as proof, which of course, if you are on the analyst side, is completely useless because again, that's just a ton of noise. So they tend to reward organizations with a lot of coverage, but don't reward ones that streamline, eliminate false positives, and really just prioritize the most important things for you to look at. And then the bottom right, that's G2 logos. I always like peer review sites like G2 or PeerSite. They tend to, mid-market and SMB tends to utilize those sites more than large enterprises do. So if you're a large enterprise, the analyst firms are better for you. If you're a little bit smaller, then the peer review sites are really good sources. Okay. So hopefully that was a good idea of what to look for in an EDR and MDR. Really quickly, I'll walk you through what Huntress's offering is here, and then I see a bunch of questions came through, so I'll make sure I leave time for those. Our main EDR option is called Managed EDR. That's our EDR and MDR service together. But we have more than that, and our company is built around management. So managed security is what we do, all to elevate the under-resourced, understaffed, under-attacked orgs in the world. So whether you're an SMB or larger than an SMB, we are built specifically for those types of organizations. So we have over 100,000 customers, protecting almost 3 million endpoints now, hundreds of thousands of identities, with about 5,000-ish managed service providers that we work with, and other partners as well. Again, our main offering, the one that applies most to today's discussion, is our managed EDR offering. So to protect your endpoints. We also have managed detection response that we layer for identities on top of Microsoft 365 as well. And I won't touch on it today, but we have a really great managed security awareness training program as well. So we can do managed lessons, managed phishing, simulated phishing scenarios, and we take all the burden off the admins and run that on our own. And it's designed by the same practitioners who protect those millions of endpoints as well. So really cool security awareness training offering. And I mentioned peer review sites. You can see, and I also mentioned that we have a cult-like following here at Huntress, and you can see that for all of these badges that we tend to win every single quarter over and over about having the best scores on G2, particularly in the SMB space. So if you look at EDR, SMB ratings on G2, it's pretty much us in the upper right corner and everyone else far to the left of us. So what exactly is our managed EDR offering? So the goal here is, again, to detect, prevent threat to the source. So it is fully managed. It's an EDR tool that is completely managed by our experts. So if you are an immature security org or a less mature security org, this is an ideal situation for you because you don't need to bring the expertise in-house. You're essentially outsourcing all that expertise to us. We're also really great when you don't have a lot of time, and no one does have a lot of time. So we eliminate almost all false positives. Our false positive rate, which is the amount of things we report to our customers that get rejected by them, is less than 1%. I think it's 0.7% the last time I checked. And we have the service on top of it. So our CSAT score for support is a ridiculous 98.8%. And that has been pretty consistent quarter to quarter over the last 3 years. And specifically, unlike a lot of those other options that we talked about there, we are designed for those resource challenge teams. So it's an affordable product. It's really the best value because we give you the affordability, we give you the simplicity, we still give you the quality that you would expect to find with the confidence that your organization is protected. Specifically, what the product does, I'll do a step-by-step here. So first of all, everything with our managed EDR is protected by our 24/7 human-led SOC. Remember at the beginning, I talked about humans versus automation. We're very much in the belief that smart humans should look at all of the, almost all of the alerts that we're sending to you and decide if they are true or false before we do that and have investigated them. So while we do have a lot of technology at their disposal, it is a very much human-led service with real people behind the screen. If you have your own EDR, your own antivirus, you can bring your own antivirus to the party. If you have Defender, the free version of Defender will actually manage that for you. It's completely optional and we don't charge extra for it, but it's a nice benefit. So what we see a lot of organizations do is ditch the AV that they're paying for, switch to the Microsoft Defender, which has pretty much the same efficacy as most of the paid AVs out there, and will not only take the information from that and include that in investigations, but also manage it for you. But the real guts of what the EDR product does is starts with detection. We have a few different areas we're looking at. First, we're looking at behavior. So looking at the processes running the machine, looking for malicious processes, and seeing if anything looks out of the ordinary. So the good example here is like there's a lot of different types of payloads attackers can drop, but there's only a small range of behaviors that we see over and over again. And when we know that it's bad behavior, we'll be able to flag that and detect it, even if it's not detected on. That's where malicious process behavior comes in. We also look at living off the land techniques with persistent foothold. So what things are attackers using to get into an environment and then stay in the environment to launch an attack later. We have a cool feature called the ransomware canary. We have these lightweight files that we essentially use as a sort of a mini honeypot where attackers might try to encrypt those, and it gives us a good early warning signal that a larger ransomware attack is coming. And we also do things proactively, look at open ports throughout an environment to see if there's any external recon happening and try to reduce risk before an attack even starts. Once we do find something, we have a human-led investigation. So almost all of our alerts are looked at by someone in our SOC. They will triage that for you. They'll investigate further, and we'll do the proactive threat hunting as well. And what's really cool is when we do find things, because we own our own technology and our own service, and they are built in the same way, we can act really fast. And so when we find something at one of our customers, we can then protect all of them immediately because we do own the tech itself. And we can move really fast. So a great example was recent Screen Connect vulnerability. We were actually able to push a vaccine or a hot fix to all of our exposed partners and have them stay protected before they even had a chance to patch. Again, it's a hot fix, so we kept them protected. That really made it a much quieter event in the Huntress world than it was outside of the Huntress world. Once our investigation does find something, we have different ways we can communicate. So first we have incident reports that we'll send you. We'll give you those guided, easy to follow, suggested next steps. We pride ourselves on the fact that even the most junior person on your IT team or your security team can follow those steps. They're not written in technical jargon. They're not meant for tier 3 security analysts in a SOC. They're meant for IT professionals and above. And we'll communicate in whatever way we need to. So email, ticketing systems, phone, SMS, and then have a range of remediation. So usually we will automatically isolate the endpoint on a sign of danger. That way it keeps the attacker from really doing any damage and spreading. Most of our remediation is done via assisted remediation. So before we proactively help you, we'll give you a one-click approval button to make sure that you really want us to take care of it. And then we give you the option for, particularly for low severity attacks, things that are important, but you'll probably take a week or two to get to it. We'll just automatically remediate that as soon as we see it. And then last, we have the management console that sits on top of that. So you have your health dashboard, your data reporting, your data export, particularly for MSPs, that's really important. So it gives you the ability to manage your entire environment. So that is a very high level walkthrough of how managed EDR works. I mentioned we also have MDR for Microsoft 365. Very similar to our managed EDR technology, except in this case, it's not our, instead of managing our EDR tool, we're sitting on top of Microsoft 365, looking for signs of account takeover, and specifically things like suspicious logins with unusual VPNs. 75% of the account takeover we see is usually unusual VPNs, shady IPs, and proxies. We're looking for signs of business email compromise. A lot of what we see there is suspicious inbox rules, things like someone takes over your inbox and starts forwarding your emails, often so that you don't catch signs of fraud. Privilege escalation attempts. And then once we do find something, the remediation options are pretty similar to the EDR tool. Proactive isolation, click to approve remediation, guided response options. One of the things that really sets us apart here is our deep expertise in account takeover. So we have a whole range of detection engineering specifically built for Microsoft 365 to detect identity-related account takeover threats. And what we've seen is hundreds of thousands and thousands of confirmed critical and high severity account takeover threats every single month. So we know this is a real threat. We know it's something that partners and customers have struggled to deal with, and got a lot of success with layering MDR on top of M365. All right. If you're interested in learning more, I would highly recommend you take a free trial. So whether it's our MDR, managed EDR, or our security awareness training, you can run a free trial just by going to our website. It's not a watered down version of the product. It's the actual product. So if you sign up for managed EDR, you'll not only get the EDR, but you'll have the 24/7 SOC on top of that for the duration of the trial, with the same humans offering the same awesome service that you would get if you were a customer. I would also say if you are a partner, if you are a managed service provider, we have a neighborhood props program. We're big believers in helping the community here. So this is ability to give you a license that you can use in your environment to protect you as the MSP, not your customers, but you internally. And that's something that we do for free. So think of it as a free trial internally that just will never end. So I did mention there were a bunch of questions. I'll try to get to a few of them before I ran out of time. So one question was like, do you need an AV, EDR, and an MDR, or can one do the job for you in terms of resources? So I think I covered that a little bit in the beginning. Like each of those is additive on top of each other. So you do need all three of them. Not having an AV would be a pretty bad decision. Not having an EDR is a bad decision, and not having an MDR is a bad decision unless you have the expertise to run that EDR in-house. Another question about data sources, asking whether we get data sources from Microsoft 365. Yes, that's part of our MDR for M365 offering. Syslog data from firewalls and domain control servers. So we actually are going to, this summer, we haven't announced it yet, but we'll have a managed SIEM solution released that will be log centrist. We'll have a lot of that data in there as well. Someone asked about using Huntress alongside an their MDR as a value in such approach. I would say not really. You're really double paying at that point. And you actually can cause conflicts between the MDR providers. What happens when both of them find something? Ideally, they both would. But you really would be, there's not huge gaps in one or the other that you think the other one can fill. I've never really seen that work out well. I'm sure it has a few times, but having two MDR providers would be pretty unusual. And then the question, I think I answered, how useful are MITRE ATT&CK evaluations for MSP, SMB contexts, or these targeted large enterprise? I would say it's not necessarily a targeted large enterprise, but first you have to understand what all the MITRE ATT&CK framework components mean and whether or not they really apply to your environment. And so you do need a decent amount of expertise to understand that. I would say the MITRE ATT&CK, just like Gartner or Forrester, it's a data point, it's not gospel. It does give you a good idea about the coverage, the breadth of each of the different areas of coverage, but not necessarily the depth of it. And certainly in the MDR world, it doesn't give you any idea about the quality of the service. So the MITRE attack for MDRs didn't even have nights or weekends as part of the attack. Like, you knew exactly what was coming and when it was coming, so you could very much game the test and put your best team looking at that environment. It doesn't necessarily indicate what an average customer is. Okay. Let's see. One last question. Asking about older agents. So I don't know exactly. I can't remember off the top of my head what versions of Windows we do cover. Some of the really legacy ones we don't, just like almost every vendor out there, like Windows 7. But I'd have to double check on some of those older servers as well. Yeah, we'll take that as a follow-up and get back to you, Jim. All right. I don't see any more questions coming in. So at this point, we're going to end the webinar. I'd like to thank each of you for your time. Thank you for listening to me for a solid hour. So I apologize if it went a little long. Hopefully this was helpful to understand what EDR makes sense for you and what MDR makes sense for you. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out, sign up for a free trial, sign up for the Neighborhood Watch program.